12 years old, you're on puberty blockers. And what were the consequences of the puberty blockers?
The puberty blockers made me kind of lightheaded all the time. So it also sort of put a little more pressure on me to start testosterone because I was sort of feeling the effects of having no estrogen or testosterone in my system. And I was getting hot flashes and just feeling kind of lightheaded. But otherwise, it just stopped any breast development, which was causing me distress at the time. But it also sort of deformed the breast development that I did have. So in a way, it sort of relieved my discomfort with my breast, but it also made it a lot worse because then the tissue was somewhat deformed.
You know, one of the questions looking at your history is, like, when did you pass threshold? I know that it's relatively common for people who start taking puberty blockers to proceed to the surgical route.
Yeah.
And that begs the question of, like, when do you make the fatal decision, so to speak, the big decision? And you might say, well, that's just before surgery. You might say it's just before testosterone. You might say it's just before puberty blockers. So as far as you're concerned, if you had to decide, when did you make the determining decision? At what point?
The decision to have surgery?
Yeah, the decision to, well, the decision to see this all the way through, let's say.
I think it was around when I started testosterone and I started, noticing my voice dropping and noticing that people were starting to just respect me a little bit more now that I looked more physiologically male. Once that happened and I was sort of fitting in socially as male, but then I was looking at my body and just seeing the disconnect. And then because of the puberty blockers, the deformities of my breast tissue was causing me so much discomfort. So it was really that.
Right.
Sort of immediately after I started testosterone at 13.
So you're trapped between fish and fowl at that point.
Right.
And, okay. And so tell me how you were evaluated before the surgery. You're 14. There's two things I want to know. How you were evaluated before the surgery, and then what you think of now about the fact that you were giving consent for that surgery, or for the puberty blockers. Puberty blockers at 12, testosterone at 13, and then a double mastectomy at 14, right? So no medical procedures are supposed to be administered without informed consent. And informed means you got all the information. And consent means you understand what the hell you're doing. Okay, so evaluation before the double mastectomy, what kind of evaluation did you get from the surgeons?
Well, the two people who wrote my referral letters were Olson and Landon, so I hardly had any extra psychological evaluation because they just wrote the letters because they'd already been seeing me and they didn't really ask me much additional questions. And then when I went in for surgery, I had already had everything scheduled. I was already cleared for surgery, so I traveled to San Francisco just because it was recommendation of Olson, the specific doctor. And by the time I was there—
Why the specific doctor?
Because he doesn't have age limits or BMI requirements and—
No age limits.
Yeah.
And that's part of Olson Kennedy, in principle, from what I understand, opposes, what does she call it? It's not blockade exactly.
Gatekeeping?
Gatekeeping.
Yeah, that's the word they use.
Right. And those who oppose gatekeeping assume that more harm is done the longer the delay.
Yes.
Right.
Right. Which I wish I had been delayed because at 14, I was really, really impulsive and not thinking things through. And
you know what that's called?
Being 14.
Yeah, that's exactly what that's called. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, by the time I was being evaluated for surgery, it was already the next day. It was already scheduled. They were drawing markings on me. And they just sort of briefly went over what the procedure was. It was just called top surgery, not double mastectomy. I didn't know even what breast tissue looked like. I think it's important to realize how desensitizing they make everything. I don't think I realized the actual damage I did to my body until much, much later on. I mean, calling it top surgery doesn't even really acknowledge that there are specific glands there that are
it's
organs.
as vague a term as you could possibly invent, as vague and harmless a term. Yeah, right. And that's purposeful and motivated, like bottom surgery, which is, although it's difficult for things to be worse, that's worse.